Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on LawBreakers. This is a fast-paced first-person shooter developed by Boss Keep Productions and published by Nexon in August of this year for PC and PS4. Obviously what you're seeing in this video is the PC version, which is pretty much dead. I mean, as I'm recording this video, the 24-hour peak of players on Steam charts, which admittedly is not 100% reliable, but it gives you a pretty good idea, was 48 players. That's right, on PC, there are less than 50 people still playing this game. It is almost impossible to get into a game at this point. Luckily, I was actually able to record some footage of this back when I got the game at the end of September, so this is basically footage from the very end of September, the very beginning of October. But even back then, I was having trouble finding games, and that was not too long after the game launched back in August. In fact, I look at the stats for this thing, and I find that there were more people playing the game during the beta than there were after it launched. And the game's just been hemorrhaging players since then to the point where it's now effectively unplayable because there's just so few people playing it that you can't actually get into a game. Hence this being an MTO rather than a review, because at this point I actually can't play the game enough to review it. I also sadly don't have a lot of gameplay footage to work with here, so let's just go ahead and delve right into it. The game runs on Unreal Engine 4, and they do use that to rather good effect. There's a fair bit of detail in the environments and the character models and animations, and they've got some pretty solid texture work and post-processing going on. The problem comes in when it comes to the aesthetic, because I'm not really sure exactly what they were trying to go for here. On the one hand, it looks like it's trying to be a bit cyberpunk, but the game's certainly not cyberpunk. It's just closer to a middle-of-the-road modern sci-fi kind of deal, and I'm not really sure it works out as well for the game as they really hoped. When you compare it to other games out there, it really doesn't have a whole lot of personality of its own other than the kind of attitude that it tries to shove at your face. Things like if an enemy kicks you and it manages to do enough damage to take you down, then you'll see a boot print appear on the screen as your corpse goes flying off into whatever location it ends up flying off into. Or how certain characters are designed to basically be edgelords, or the just general sense of irreverence and, hey, look at how cool we are that the game tries to exude. In some cases it works okay, in other cases it just ends up being kind of annoying. And the end result is visuals that are certainly pretty high quality, but unfortunately just don't have a lot of personality or charm behind them, and thus they actually become very bland. Similar issues happen with the sound design, where the soundtrack is a mixture of electronic, rock, metal, and also occasionally some dubstep. And it features tracks from the likes of Jack Wall, Malcolm Kirby Jr., and of course Mick Gordon. Although those of you who were fans of Wolfenstein The New Order's soundtrack or the Doom 4 soundtrack will be gravely disappointed, because the music that he does in this is actually not nothing but obnoxious noise. He's attributed to 3 tracks, one of which is basically electronic pop music, another of which is somewhere between industrial metal and electronic rock, and the only track that he does in the entire soundtrack that you fans of Doom 4 and Wolfenstein The New Order will like is the song called Toxa 9, which is the kind of obnoxious noise garbage that you people seem to like. But triggering Doom 4 fanboys aside, the soundtrack actually has quite a bit of variety in it, and that's actually pretty well appreciated, because a lot of it is fairly upbeat, and a lot of it is rather high intensity. So if they wanted to make music that would work well with a fast-paced arcadey shooter like this, then they did a pretty good job of that. When you move over into sound effects, though, they don't really have all that many beefy sound effects, and those that are beefy are only beefy in comparison to the other sound effects in the game. None of them have a particularly good bass punch to them, which means that they don't really feel like they have a lot of oomph behind them, and you end up with gun and explosion sounds that are relatively weak. Then you move over into voice acting, and it's just serviceable at best. I mean, you gotta keep in mind that these characters don't really have a whole lot of personality to them, and even when they do have something vaguely resembling personality, it's pretty minimal. Thus, the battle chatter tends to be very underwhelming, and ultimately you have a situation where all of the voice acting ends up being weaker by nature of it just not having any real charm to it. It's not that they do a bad job or anything. I mean, they voice their lines relatively well. It's just that the writing isn't really there, and they probably didn't get a lot of direction with regards to actually giving these characters some proper personality. And that's a real shame, because this game desperately needed some personality, and unfortunately it's just not there. They seem to think that their faux edgy attitude with certain things was enough to compensate for that, and it really isn't. because the game doesn't really have any story to speak of, and you're thrown into the game with a bunch of characters that you know basically nothing about except what few blurbs the game gives you about them, which is almost nothing. And when you're actually playing the game, it's a multiplayer game, so nobody's really going to get any proper characterization anyway. Thus, when you get down to it, everything falls to the gameplay to bring things up, and that's actually where things get very interesting, because this is trying to be kind of a combination of a hero shooter and an arena shooter. It combines the fast-paced and high-precision gameplay of an arena shooter with the class system of a hero shooter. Or at least that was the idea behind the game originally. In its current state, or at least the last state I was actually able to play it in, I should say, movement speed was actually rather slow. The only one that actually feels like a proper arena shooter character is the assassin class, which is the one that has the dual blades and uses them actually to swing along for greater momentum. A couple of the other characters have ways to increase their movement speed, but by and large, everybody moves very slowly unless they're in ZeroG. And that's where things get very interesting, because the game was really hyping up the ZeroG aspect of it, and they don't really capitalize on it as well as they could. When you're actually in ZeroG, anything you do will actually have an effect on your momentum, and one of the things you can do is called blind fire, where you actually shoot behind you, and you can use that to actually propel yourself forward in ZeroG. This will allow you to move more quickly than you would normally, and that sort of thing is actually rather interesting, and on top of that, it creates some room for some rather high skill maneuvers. The problem is that ZeroG is relegated to specific parts of the maps, and on some of the maps they barely even have any ZeroG areas at all. And for a game billing itself as gravity-defying combat, there is a distinct lack of gravity-defying going on. And you know what the really sad part is? When you're actually going in that high-momentum ZeroG gameplay, things get really intense really quickly, and they're actually quite a lot of fun. In fact, whenever you can get any real degree of momentum and speed going, the game actually ends up being rather enjoyable, but most of the time you can't really do that. It ultimately means that the advanced movement system is kind of self-defeating because it's cordoned off to specific areas, and usually they're on the periphery of the map. If your main thoroughfares on the map are going to be just normal areas where there's no ZeroG and there's not really much momentum changing going on, then that means that the vast majority of the time you're running around in the level, it's rather sluggish and frankly quite boring. I feel like if the entire maps were in ZeroG, or if very, very large sections of the map were in ZeroG, then that will work a lot better. But once you get past the interesting but unfortunately underused movement system, they have a handful of game modes that really aren't all that interesting. I mean, the main mode of the game is that you have to go find a battery in the middle of the map, and then you have to take it back to your base and defend it until it reaches 100% charge. Once it's charged, you have to hold on to it for another 20 seconds, and then you actually gain a point. Thing is that the enemy team can actually steal the battery at whatever charge level it's currently at, and then go from there. Another mode is basically the exact same thing, only instead of a battery, you're charging a satellite dish, and it lacks the stealing capacity that you can have for the battery in the previous mode I mentioned. Another mode is literally just King of the Hill, where your team has to hang on to a certain point for a specific amount of time until eventually the point will change to a different location on the map. Another mode is just domination, but instead of holding on to the points and gradually getting a point trickle, then you hang on to the points, and once they're all captured, then they reset to neutral and you have to go back and capture them again. Then of course there's the blitzball mode, where there's a ball that spawns in the middle of the map, and then you have to go and capture that and then manage to get it through the other team's goal. And when you pick up the ball, a counter will start, and once it hits 0, then you instantly die. So it behooves you to quickly get that ball through the enemy's goal in time. I wouldn't really say that any of these modes are particularly fresh or exciting, but they do have a few different twists on them than what you're used to from standard game modes in other titles. And of course they are better when you're actually working together with your team in order to achieve the goals. The thing is, you don't really have as much team synergy in this as you would in other games out there, including something along the lines of Overwatch. It's because of the fundamental difference in the way they've set up the classes. You see, the classes in LawBreakers are set up to be more like an arena shooter than anything else, which means that almost all of their abilities are offensive rather than defensive or supportive. In fact, I'd go so far as to argue that there's only one support class in the entire game, and that would be the Battle Medic, and even it has a lot of offensive capability. I get that what they were trying to go for here is a much more fast-paced, far more aggressive kind of first-person shooter than the lines of Overwatch or other team-oriented shooters that are out there right now. But the effect that that's had is that when you go into this game, you're going to just stick with whatever class you're good with, not with whatever the team actually needs. And the game being so heavily centered on individual skill also makes it rather difficult to work together with your team in order to achieve your goals, because everybody's just going to be running off and doing their own thing and pretty much ignoring any attempts at teamwork that you try to set up. See, that's not to say that you can't work together with your team, but it's not really incentivized as well as they think it is. Because from a raw mechanical standpoint, everything is set up to emphasize individual skill in combat, and that's not something that meshes well with good team play. So that of course brings up the question of how the combat is. Well, there are 9 classes to choose from, and each of them do have their own way of doing things. Most of the weapons in the game are actually projectile based, which means that you do have to actually calculate in your head where your shot is going to line up, and you have to actually lead your targets a bit. That's not to say that there aren't any hit scan weapons at all. There are certainly hit scan weapons in the game, but they are generally a bit weaker than the projectile based weapons, and you have to be very precise with them to get anything resembling good damage out of them. But beyond simply the weapon loadouts for each character, they all have their own special abilities, and those are done in much the same way as you would see any hero shooter out there right now. Meaning basically 2 normal abilities and then a super ability that charges up over time, and eventually you can unleash it for usually massive damage, unless you're playing a battle medic, in which case it puts up a rather large shield instead. And to be perfectly honest with you, that's really not very conducive to an arena shooter. That's what you would see from a hero shooter, and for those games it works fine. But for something like this, where it puts a high emphasis on individual skill in combat, that's not really all that intuitive. As a result, the game just ends up coming across as rather confused in its design. It's not sure whether it wants to be a hero shooter or an arena shooter, and tries to be both, but doesn't really do either all that successfully. And I think that's part of the problem, is because people who are into hero shooters play it and they're like, well, why would I play this over, say, Paladins or Overwatch? And people who play arena shooters play it and they go, wait a minute, why would I play this over Unreal Tournament or Quake? It occupies a pretty uncomfortable middle ground and doesn't really end up satisfying either party that it's trying to appeal to. And when you get down to it, as far as I can tell, it's too skill-based for people who are into hero shooters, but it's not skill-based enough for people who are into arena shooters. Especially since they modified the amount of time it takes to start regenerating your health. Before, it would take quite a while to regenerate, but then they put in a patch later on that decreased the amount of time it takes to actually start regenerating your health to almost no time at all, meaning that fights can just kind of drag on, because it only takes a couple of seconds for the health to start regenerating. I think the idea there was to make the game a bit more accessible to newer players, but it didn't really work. And as a result of the changes they've made, as well as just it being this weird middle ground that doesn't really satisfy anyone to any great degree, they've lost the player base. And at this point, I'm not even sure if it going free to play would be able to save it. And that's a real shame, because when this game is firing on all cylinders, then it's actually a ton of fun to play. The problem is that it rarely fires on all cylinders, and now that the player base is almost completely gone, you basically can't even get into a game to attempt to get it to fire on all cylinders anymore. Maybe if it went free to play, then that would keep the game alive for a bit longer, but I very highly doubt that it would stay alive for very long. I mean, for those of you who are absolutely reliant on progression systems, there is no progression in this game other than just getting cosmetic unlocks. And you get those in a system that is completely identical to the way you get skins and such in Overwatch, where you have loot boxes that will either give you some currency, or they will give you various skins, so you either have to get lucky with a skin drop, or you have to get lucky with the amount of credits that you earn. And you can eventually buy the item that you want. But thankfully, there is no pay-to-win garbage in this. The unlocks in the loot boxes are only cosmetics. And when you compare the business model to other games that are trying to do a similar thing, you find that it's actually a pretty reasonable one. The base game is $30 by itself, and I mean it's multiplayer only, so you're not getting a single player campaign here, and that was actually one of the things that Cliff Bleszinski actually specifically called out when he was advertising the game. That they don't have any of that $60 multiplayer only bullshit, his words, not mine. Even though it's a mark against the game to have loot boxes themselves, at least they're cosmetics only, so you can't have any of that pay-to-win bullshit like you can in Battlefront 2, for example. And all of the content updates in the future are just included with your purchase of the game, so they do have a decent enough business model going on, but I'm not sure there's really a market for this game. It's not really arena shooter-y enough for arena shooter fans, and it's not hero shooter-y enough for hero shooter fans. It's just this weird middle ground and doesn't end up satisfying either party as well as it could if they just went full on with those particular genres. And really, that's reflected in the few amount of players that it still has. Apparently, it has a better population on PS4 than it does on PC, which doesn't really surprise me. But it's also painfully obvious that the game was designed around a keyboard and mouse and not a gamepad. So you get higher intensity gameplay on PC, but nobody's playing it. And when there's basically nobody still playing your multiplayer game, then honestly, you might as well just remove it from sale entirely. So obviously I can't recommend the game at all to anyone right now just because it's not a good value proposition to buy into a game and then not be able to play it. If the game somehow ever gets its player base back and gets enough people to where it's a stable community that can actually find games regularly, then maybe I'll take another look at it and maybe it would be worth playing at that point. But right now, I unfortunately cannot recommend it even though it does actually have its moments, and those moments are very strong. So we'll see what happens. Maybe they'll turn it around later on, and maybe they'll go free to play and make it worth playing or something along those lines, but right now, I doubt it. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you all in later videos.